The most dangerous error a man can commit is to allow a woman to underestimate him. I did it by design. My name is Lachlan Miller, and on a crisp Friday morning in April 2023, Isabella made that mistake. The scene was our residence in Point Piper, Sydney, a place defined by sweeping views of the harbor and an atmosphere of curated, quiet luxury. The morning air was sharp, carrying the faint, briny scent of the Pacific, yet the silence inside the house was absolute. Isabella was already prepared for the day. She stood in the kitchen, a vision of corporate precision in a tailored navy blazer, her presence as sharp and calculated as the high-stakes boardrooms in Barangaroo she commanded. She did not look at me. She was focused on her phone, her thumb gliding over the screen with the practiced rhythm of a CEO. Without breaking her stride, she placed a manila envelope on the marble island, right next to my coffee mug. It was embossed with the logo of one of Sydney's most prominent legal firms, a crest that signaled finality before a word was even spoken. "My lawyers have finalized the documentation," she stated, her voice devoid of inflection, matching the clinical nature of the act. She did not raise her eyes from her phone. I should have addressed this at the very beginning. I have worked far too hard to leave any aspect of my professional future to chance. I looked at the envelope. It was crisp, intimidatingly professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. I was not shocked by the document itself. I had been anticipating this move for months. What surprised me was the timing. I reached out, my fingers tracing the cold texture of the paper. "What is this, Isabella?" I asked, though the question was a formality. A quiet, observant part of my mind had already decoded the intent. "It is a prenuptial agreement," she replied, as casually as one might discuss the dry cleaning. She finally looked up, offering that polished smile that never quite reached the hardness in her eyes. I realized the timing may seem unconventional after 2 years of marriage, but it is precisely for that reason that we require total clarity moving forward. Please take your time to review it. My legal team is available should you require any clarifications regarding the stipulations. She gathered her leather bag, adjusted her posture, and walked toward the door. She did not offer a kiss goodbye, a gesture that had been absent for months. I watched the door click shut, the sound resonating through the pristine, hollow space of the house. I was left alone with the envelope. Inside were 11 pages, her signature already affixed to the final sheet, as if this were merely a routine real estate settlement. As I began to read, the weight of her ambition became clear. My assets were described as unverified and presumed minimal. A cold, crystalline clarity settled in my chest. She thought she was protecting her empire from a man of limited means. She had no idea that she had just ignited a war. The narrative of our marriage did not begin that Friday in April, but 3 years earlier, on a humid Wednesday evening in February 2020. The setting was an alumni networking mixer held at a venue overlooking the Parramatta River, the kind of event where everyone is either aggressively building their career or desperately performing the act of doing so. I was standing near the back, nursing a glass of soda water, watching the crowd with the detached curiosity of a man who had already exited the rat race. My friend Dave, a relentless optimist, had insisted I attend. "You have not been out since you sold your company," he had chided. "You are becoming the type of man who treats his house plants like colleagues." I did not own house plants, but I understood his point. I was becoming increasingly invisible. That was the night Isabella Voss found me. She moved through the room with an effortless, predatory grace, wearing a black dress that commanded attention. She did not seek out the loudest person in the room. She sought out the one who seemed to be observing the rest. "You are not working the room," she remarked, stepping into my periphery. She did not sound like she was making small talk. She sounded like she was evaluating a potential acquisition. I looked around. I replied, keeping my tone mild. "Neither are you." She laughed, a genuine, sharp sound that piqued my interest. "Touché. I am Isabella Voss. And you are?" "Lachlan Miller," I said, offering the most mundane description possible. "I'm a consultant, mostly retired. I dabble." Most people moved on after the word dabble. Isabella did not. We spent 2 hours in a corner, discussing logistics, market volatility, and the peculiar nature of ambition. She was the CEO of a mid-sized logistics firm, Voss Logistics, a company she was scaling with investor backing. She was astute, cynical, and possessed an understated humor that I found captivating. She looked at me not with affection, but as if I were a complex puzzle she had yet to solve. I should have recognized that gaze. I had worn it myself countless times. What Isabella believed she knew about me that night was that I was a comfortable, low-profile consultant with a nice apartment in Point Piper and a sensible, unpretentious demeanor. She thought she had found a man who would serve as a stabilizing backdrop to her ascent. The truth, however, was far more complex. 3 years prior, I had quietly sold a supply chain software firm I had built over a decade to a private equity consortium in Melbourne for a sum that would have made my accountant lose his composure. I had no press release, no LinkedIn announcement, and no celebratory banquet. I simply signed the documents, returned to my apartment, and watched a documentary on the Southern Ocean. Wealth that makes noise attracts the wrong kind of attention. I had witnessed enough men lose their foundations to public ego to understand that the quietest person in the room is invariably the most dangerous. Isabella did not know that she was not just dating a consultant. She was dating a man who held stakes in 11 different entities, owned property across 4 continents, through holding companies she had never heard of, and had not disclosed his true net worth to a single soul in years. She thought she was building a life with a quiet man. In reality, she had unwittingly invited an architect in her world. She was looking for a prop for her public image, unaware that she had chosen a man who preferred to construct the entire stage from the shadows. That night in 2020 was the prologue to a tragedy she had yet to write, and I was the only one who knew the ending. For the first 14 months of our marriage, I played the role of the devoted, low-profile partner to perfection. I accompanied Isabella to corporate galas at the Sydney Opera House and industry mixers in Barangaroo, content to stand at her shadow while she introduced me as her brilliant, understated partner. I wore my role as an artisanal accessory, maintaining a modest watch and an air of quiet contentment. It was a calculated performance, one I executed with the same diligence I had once applied to my business ventures. The shift occurred on a Sunday in November 2022. Isabella was at the office, a recurring theme that had become the rhythm of our lives, and I was at our kitchen table in Point Piper, reviewing our household investment portfolio. We maintained a shared digital drive for tax records, insurance policies, and property deeds. I was searching for a missing homeowner's insurance renewal, and in my digital navigation, I took a wrong turn into a subfolder labeled Archive. I opened a file titled Exit Strategy _Voss. My first thought was that it used an exceptionally clean, professional font for something so devastating. I read it once, then again, ensuring the clinical language did not escape me. It was 12 pages of pure, strategic calculation. It detailed our marriage not as a union, but as an asset management structure. My financial profile was analyzed, and my perceived minimal assets were categorized as non-factors in her long-term planning. There was a strict 5-year timeline. Year 2, consolidate joint accounts. Year 3, bolster her public asset base. Year 5, initiate formal dissolution. My breath hitched, not out of shock, but out of a profound, cold clarity. On page 7, a name appeared, Brett Calloway. He was a partner at Voss Logistics, a man who had shaken my hand at 3 separate company dinners, always with a firm grip and a patronizing buddy whenever he addressed me. He was the linchpin of her next phase. I closed the laptop and walked into our kitchen. I began to knead dough for pasta, finding that the physical labor required a level of focus that mirrored the precision of the document I had just read. I opened a bottle of local red wine, setting 2 places at the table with methodical care. Sitting in the silence, I understood the true nature of my marriage. Isabella had not chosen me in spite of my invisibility. She had chosen me because of it. I had no public persona, no ego requiring maintenance, and no social media footprint. To her, I was a financial safe house, a quiet, modest husband who would neutralize the questions from her board and investors regarding her lifestyle. I was never a partner. I was a component of a larger strategy. That evening, when she returned at 8:47 p.m., the smell of the meal greeted her, as it always did. "Something smells wonderful," she remarked, dropping her bag. "Casio e pepe," I replied, my voice steady. We ate, we spoke of her day, and we retired to bed. She slept with the ease of someone who believed her future was secured. I laid awake, staring at the ceiling, and made a decision. I had spent years building companies and managing risk. I knew how to handle an adversary. She had been playing a long game, unaware that she was seated across from a master of the board. My silence was not weakness. It was the quiet buildup of a storm. I would wait, I would observe, and I would dismantle her strategy piece by piece from the inside out. The days following my discovery in the archive folder were characterized by a discipline so intense it felt mechanical. I continued to move through our life in Point Piper with the same predictable, soft-spoken demeanor Isabella had grown to rely on. To her, I was still the man who enjoyed simple weekend mornings and quiet afternoons. She had no idea that her every word now served as data for my counter-strategy. I needed an architect for the structural dismantling of her plans, and there was only one person capable of maintaining the requisite level of discretion: Angus Thompson. Angus was a legal veteran based in Melbourne, a man whose reputation for ferocity was matched only by his absolute refusal to leave a paper trail. I had worked with him during the inception of my first company, and he had been my silent partner in every major acquisition since. I waited until Isabella left for a regional logistics summit in Queensland to place the call. "Angus," I said, skipping the pleasantries, "I need you to come to Sydney." "Is it a matter of urgency, Lachlan?" he asked, his voice steady. He knew me well enough to understand that I did not summon him for trivialities. "Let's say someone has been playing a game of chess with a man who invented the board," I replied, looking out over the harbor, watching the ferry's trace lines across the water. "The game is coming to a close. I will be on the evening flight," he promised. When Angus arrived the following morning, he found me in my small, nondescript office in the financial district, a space I leased under a holding entity Isabella had never heard of. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of her office in Barangaroo. Angus sat across from me, his expression that of a man who already sensed the weight of the coming storm. I walked him through the timeline of the past 3 years. The mixer, the marriage, the discovery of the exit strategy file, and the inclusion of Brett Calloway. He listened with the focus of a surgeon, his legal pad gathering notes that would ultimately dismantle the infrastructure Isabella had spent years constructing. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. She documented everything, Angus noted, his eyes narrowing. That level of detail is either the height of arrogance or an act of profound stupidity. "It is both," I said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk, "the initial roadmap for our retaliation. And that is exactly what we are going to exploit." He scanned the document, his eyebrows rising in recognition of the path I had laid out. "You have been sitting on this since November? 5 months of preparation. I have had time to refine the strategy," I replied. She provided the timeline in her own file. "We have runway, but we must be precise." As he studied the plan, Angus did something I had not seen in over a decade of our professional relationship. He smiled, a thin, sharp expression of genuine appreciation for the complexity of the task. "Okay," he said, setting his pen down. "Let us build something. But remember, Lachlan, to win this, you must remain the person she thinks you are until the very last second. If she senses even a minor deviation in your character, the structural integrity of our plan will be compromised." I nodded, feeling a cold, anchoring peace. I had spent years learning that patience is not a passive state. It is an aggressive, calculated act. It is the ability to wake up every morning knowing exactly what is coming and choosing to wait. I was no longer just her husband. I was the silent, inevitable tide coming in to erode the foundation of her perfectly constructed lie. The execution of our strategy required the kind of surgical precision that only a well-structured legal entity could provide. On the following Monday, Angus Thompson oversaw the registration of a new holding company in Melbourne, which we named Blue Gum Holdings. The name was intentionally unremarkable, a title so mundane that it would cause an auditor's eyes to glaze over. In a world of high-stakes finance, boredom is the most effective camouflage. Interest and intrigue are signals that alert the opposition, whereas a name like Blue Gum suggests nothing more than a conservative, domestic investment vehicle. This was exactly what we needed. Our first objective through Blue Gum Holdings was to acquire a 12% stake in Voss Logistics. This was the centerpiece of Isabella's world, the company she discussed at dinner, the focus of her board meetings, and the asset she was most determined to wall off from me. Acquiring equity in a firm one's spouse leads is a delicate process, particularly when one wishes to remain anonymous. Angus spread the purchase across 3 distinct tranches, utilizing shell structures that connected to Blue Gum Holdings like a series of mirrors. By fragmenting the acquisition, we ensured that no single transaction triggered the disclosure requirements mandated by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC. For weeks, I watched as the ownership registry shifted by fractions of a percent. It was an exercise in extreme patience. I would spend my Saturday mornings in the financial district coordinating with Angus to finalize the transfers, and then return to Point Piper to spend the afternoon with Isabella. The duality of this existence was taxing, yet it sharpened my focus. One evening, after I had successfully finalized the final tranche of shares, Isabella sat across from me at our dining table, discussing the logistical challenges of a new contract in Western Australia. She looked at me with that familiar, patronizing warmth, unaware that I now held a significant, silent interest in the very company she was describing. "You are my favorite person, Lachlan," she remarked, oblivious to the reality that the foundation beneath her feet had just been reconfigured. "You are full of surprises, Isabella," I replied, my voice perfectly modulated. "I'm in it," though the context was entirely different from what she imagined. She had no idea that her low-profile husband was no longer merely a passenger in her life. I was now a silent partner in her legacy. We continued our routine, walking the cliffs at Watson's Bay on Sunday mornings and attending formal functions in the city, all while I systematically dismantled her sense of control. Every transaction was a piece of the puzzle, a calculated move in a game she believed she was winning. By the time the ink was dry on the final filing, the structure of our marriage had undergone a fundamental shift. I had become the owner of the ground she walked on, yet to the world, and to Isabella, I remained the quiet man who did not know his own worth. This was the power of being underestimated. It allowed me to move with a freedom that Isabella's arrogance would never permit her to possess. The facade of our marriage became an exercise in profound psychological endurance. To the casual observer, and certainly to Isabella, our life in Point Piper remained an image of curated stability. We continued our Sunday morning rituals, walking the windswept trails of the North Head Sanctuary, where the Tasman Sea crashes against the sandstone cliffs. Isabella would discuss the nuances of her board meetings with an air of practiced confidence, and I would offer the sympathetic, measured responses that had long been part of my repertoire. Every interaction was a delicate performance. I had to calibrate my engagement with precision. For the moment I deviated from the expected, I risked shattering the illusion that kept her vulnerability exposed. There were evenings, however, when the silence of the house felt almost heavy with the weight of my deception. I would sit in our study, the ambient light of the Sydney skyline shimmering through the glass, and contemplate the irony of my situation. I had built a career on the ability to read market signals, yet the most difficult analysis I had ever performed was on my own life. I was dismantling the very future Isabella had envisioned, not through anger, but through a cold, necessary reconstruction of reality. I continued to drive into the city every Saturday morning to meet with Angus, ensuring that the integration of our logistical assets remained airtight. My days were split between 2 worlds, one of domestic normalcy and one of strategic expansion. Yet, The emotional toll manifested in the smallest of things. In our hallway sat a small, bronze sculpture of a lighthouse, a piece we had purchased together during a weekend trip to Port Douglas when our future felt like a shared horizon. One evening, while tidying the foyer, I accidentally knocked it from its pedestal. It did not shatter. Instead, a hidden hairline fracture, likely present since its creation, finally gave way, splitting the structure perfectly in two. As I stared at the severed halves, I realized the object was a perfect reflection of us. I picked up the pieces, and instead of attempting to mend them, I felt a strange, detached finality. I placed the two halves in the bin, side by side, and walked away. The act was a silent burial of the last vestige of the man I had been when I truly believed in US. I learned that the most difficult part of a long-game strategy is not the technical execution, but the preservation of one's own resolve. Whenever the sense of betrayal threatened to cloud my judgment, I would recall the sight of that document in the archive folder, then the image of the split lighthouse. These memories acted as a corrective, guiding me back to the necessary coldness required to complete the task. I became a master of the mundane, ensuring that every glance, every nod, and every comment was consistent with the man she believed she had captured. I was, in every sense, a ghost inhabiting the architecture of her life, watching as her pillars were slowly replaced by those of my own design. The irony was absolute. The more happy our marriage appeared to be, the more successful I was in my silent campaign. It was not a marriage of equals. It was a siege, and Isabella, in her immense confidence, remained entirely unaware that the walls had already been breached. By the summer of 2023, my strategy shifted from passive accumulation to active disruption within the logistics sector. Isabella's dinner conversations had become a reliable barometer for the weaknesses in her empire. She spoke frequently of the mounting pressures on her supply chain, specifically citing the thinning margins of her primary freight suppliers in Brisbane and the logistical bottlenecks plaguing her last-mile operations in Western Australia. She would lament these challenges, looking for empathy, while I would offer carefully considered advice that served a dual purpose. It made me appear as her trusted sounding board while simultaneously providing me with the intelligence I needed to strike. I began to leverage the resources of Blue Gum Holdings to quietly acquire minority interests in those very freight providers. These were not controlling stakes, nor were they designed to be conspicuous. They were strategic investments that secured me a seat at the table during contract renewal negotiations. By late August, I had effectively placed myself in a position where, when Isabella's team sat down to renegotiate their terms, the individuals across the table were several layers removed from her, yet ultimately accountable to me. The irony was exquisite. She was constantly complaining about the rising costs of her vendors, never realizing that those very vendors were now reporting to an entity I controlled. This level of influence required constant vigilance. I had to ensure that the cross-ownership remained obfuscated by multiple tiers of holding. Companies and trust structures designed by Angus. We utilized offshore entities and domestic investment vehicles to create a maze that would confuse even a seasoned forensic accountant. It was a sophisticated game of financial chess. During this period, my interactions with Isabella took on a surreal quality. We would dine at exclusive restaurants in the Sydney CBD, and she would tell me about her difficult negotiations with her suppliers, unaware that her husband had essentially dictated the terms of those very discussions. I felt a certain grim satisfaction during these moments, but I tempered it with the knowledge that the trap was not yet fully sprung. My goal was not simply to cause her temporary frustration. It was to create a situation where the structural integrity of her professional life was entirely dependent on my goodwill, or, as the case may be, my eventual withdrawal. I began to spend more time monitoring the performance metrics of these suppliers, ensuring they were optimized to Isabella's requirements just enough to keep her complacent, while slowly tightening the control over the underlying contracts. I was no longer just observing the landscape. I was terraforming it. Isabella was still the pilot of her ship, but I was the one who had quietly altered the navigation charts, ensuring that every destination she chose led directly to the conclusion I had authored. It was a cold, calculated expansion of my reach, executed in the silence of the night, while Isabella remained preoccupied with the illusion that she was still the architect of her own destiny. By the onset of autumn, the final piece of the strategic board fell into place. Angus called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice low and devoid of its usual professional detachment. "Brett Calloway," he stated. I paused, setting my coffee mug down on the glass desk of my city office. Calloway, the partner at Voss Logistics, whose name had been etched into page 7 of Isabella's exit strategy, had begun soliciting capital for a private investment fund he was launching on the side. It was a secondary pursuit, a way for him to leverage his corporate standing into personal wealth. He's shopping for an anchor investor, Angus continued. He needs $2 million to secure the initial raise. He is being incredibly quiet about it, hoping to keep his corporate masters at Voss Logistics out of the loop. "Become a partner," I instructed, my voice unwavering. "But ensure the layers are absolute. I want 4 levels of separation between his fund and Blue Gum Holdings. He cannot know who is providing the capital." "4 layers?" Angus questioned, a hint of amusement in his tone. "That is an arduous audit path, even for a seasoned investigator." "Then it is the correct path," I replied. I wanted to shake my hand at our next company dinner while unknowingly operating on my capital. By the early weeks of winter, the transaction was complete. I was now a silent, limited partner in Brett Calloway's private fund. The man who had patronized me for years, the man who Isabella believed would be her stabilizing partner in the years following our divorce, was now, through a series of complex financial conduits, entirely dependent on my capital. It was the ultimate irony. Calloway was building his future on the foundation I had provided, all while believing he was outmaneuvering the minimal consultant Isabella had described to him. I reflected on this during a weekend spent at a retreat in the Blue Mountains. Isabella was relaxed, convinced that her professional and personal trajectories were perfectly aligned. She spoke of her future with Calloway as if it were an inevitability, a logical progression of her exit strategy. I listened, offering the same steady, supportive smiles that had kept her unsuspecting for so long. She saw my silence as approval. She could not perceive it as the quiet, watchful stillness of a predator waiting for the optimal moment to strike. This was the core of my design. I had not merely defended myself. I had absorbed the architecture of her betrayal and repurposed it. Every contract, every investment, and every association Isabella had groomed for her liberation was now tethered to me. I had created a financial ecosystem where she could move only in ways that I allowed, while Calloway, the unwitting catalyst of her plan, was actively working to inflate the very interests I would soon reclaim. The stage was set. The board was complete. Isabella believed she was nearing the culmination of her 5-year plan, entirely unaware that the path she was traveling had been redirected by the man she had so carelessly underestimated. I felt no rush, only a profound, crystalline certainty that the conclusion was now inevitable. The morning of April 3rd, 2024, arrived with a crisp, cool clarity that felt distinct from any other day. It was exactly 1 year since Isabella had placed the prenuptial agreement on our kitchen table in Point Piper, initiating a game she believed she was winning. I stood at my office window in the Sydney Financial District, watching the morning light glint off the harbor as the city began its daily migration toward the corporate hubs of Barangaroo. The air felt charged with the static of an impending resolution. At 9 a.m., my phone vibrated. It was Angus. "Everything is in position," he said, his tone devoid of fanfare. "The documentation is ready for delivery. Do you want me to initiate the countermove?" "No," I corrected him, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "This is not a countermove, Angus. It is a revelation. I want our legal team to sit down the moment they open the envelope. I want the senior partner to close his office door and understand that his firm has been working in an environment they never truly audited. Give me 3 weeks to ensure the shock settles, and then notify them." "You have been waiting for this moment for a long time, Lachlan," he noted quietly. "I have been waiting for the board to be set," I replied. I hung up and leaned back in my chair, allowing the weight of the moment to anchor me. 2 weeks later, Angus arrived at my office carrying a thick, bound document, 47 pages of irrefutable financial forensics. He placed it on the desk with the gravity of someone handling a detonator. "This is everything," he said, his voice measured. "The full documentation of your 11 technology investments, the unicorn valuations, the real estate holdings across 4 continents, the logistics network, the 12% stake in Voss Logistics, and the full trail of the Callaway Fund. Every layer is mapped and linked back to you. They will not be able to refute a single line." I opened the document, the pages turning with a clean, rhythmic sound. Her original prenuptial agreement had been a meager 11 pages, built on the assumption of my obsolescence. I had come back with an entire, complex infrastructure that she had never bothered to investigate. "Send it," I commanded. The response came 4 days later. It did not come from Isabella, but from her lead attorney, Gary Ostroff, a senior partner in a firm that had built its reputation on navigating the most difficult family law disputes in Sydney. Angus informed me that the initial call lasted less than 6 minutes. Ostroff had spoken with the strained, careful precision of a man who realized mid-sentence that he was stepping across thin ice. "Mr. Tanner," Ostroff had said, his voice tight, "it appears that your client's holdings are considerably more substantial than our preliminary inquiry suggested." "Yes," Angus had replied, the amusement barely concealed behind his professionalism. "They are. Mr. Heston would like to revisit the terms of the prenuptial agreement, I presume?" "No," Angus had countered, just as I had instructed. "The terms remain exactly as your client drafted them. Mr. Heston does not wish to change a single word." A long, suffocating silence had followed. I could imagine Ostroff sitting in his glass-walled office in the city, staring at the files and realizing that his client's meticulously crafted exit strategy had just become a prison of her own making. The math no longer added up to her advantage. It had shifted irrevocably. The revelation was not just a legal maneuver. It was the psychological turning point. The board had tilted, and Isabella was about to realize that while she had been focusing on the exit, I had been busy redefining the entire structure of the building. The shift in the atmosphere at our Point Piper residence was palpable, a sudden drop in pressure that precedes a storm. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Isabella returned home early, an anomaly in her schedule that signaled the final collapse of her defenses. I walked through the front door to find her sitting at the kitchen island, her laptop closed and her phone face down on the marble. The blazer was gone, replaced by a simple sweater, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked less like a corporate entity and more like a woman who had finally been confronted with a reality she could not manage. "Gary Ostroff called me," she said, her voice lacking its usual, polished steel. She did not turn to look at me, but stared out at the harbor, where the water was darkening under a heavy, overcast sky. "Your attorney sent him a comprehensive disclosure. I assume you know what that means." "I know exactly what it means," I replied, setting my keys on the counter with a deliberate, calm motion. I leaned against the island, keeping a respectful distance. "Harlan Ridge," she whispered, naming the primary entity Angus had used for our maneuvers. "You own a significant portion of my company. Lachlan, you own the suppliers. You own the Callaway Fund." She turned then, her eyes narrowing with a flash of her former tactical brilliance. She stood up, crossing the kitchen with the measured gait of a so, regaining her footing. "Let us dispense with the pretense. If you truly own 12% of Voss Logistics through opaque layers, then your purchase violated the board's transparency bylaws. I can trigger a forensic audit of the shareholder registry. I can initiate an injunction against Blue Gum Holdings, arguing that your acquisition was a breach of fiduciary trust, especially considering our marital status. I can drag you through the Supreme Court of New South Wales for years, and by the time you actually own those shares, the company's value will have been bled dry by the legal fees. You think you have me in a corner? You have merely invited a scorched earth policy." She looked at me, her expression a mix of defiance and desperate calculation. "You have played a clever game, Lachlan, but you have mistaken my professional caution for fragility. I will dismantle every one of your shell companies before I let you walk away with my legacy. I remained unmoved, watching her with a calm detachment that seemed to unsettle her. More than rage. Isabella, you are a brilliant strategist. You truly are. But you are analyzing this like a CEO, not like a spouse who signed her own death warrant. I stepped forward, sliding a single, thin document across the marble. Your prenuptial agreement specifically stipulates that all personal investments, regardless of their growth or origin, are the sole, separate property of the signatory, provided they were initiated after the date of our marriage. I did not breach any bylaws. I bought those shares through a registered investment vehicle that fully disclosed its intent to the regulator. Your lawyers, in their zeal to protect your autonomy, drafted a clause that explicitly prevents you from contesting any asset I acquired independently during our union. You did not just protect your assets, you locked yourself out of mine. You cannot audit what the law has already defined as legally segregated. Her face went pale as the reality of her own document's wording struck her. The defiance in her eyes flickered and died. She sank back onto the stool, her hands trembling as she reached for the paper. You checked the clauses, she whispered, her voice devoid of its former steel. You knew this was coming the entire time. I did not just check the clauses, I replied softly. I waited for you to build the walls of the trap yourself. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. She had fought back with logic, only to find that I had used the very weapon she had forged to end her. The CEO was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of her own hubris. The formal dissolution proceedings commenced in the high-ceilinged quiet of a boardroom in the Sydney CBD, a stark contrast to the emotional dissonance that had permeated our home. Angus Thompson sat across from Gary Ostroff, a man whose reputation for invincibility was now fraying under the weight of the evidence we had presented. The prenuptial agreement Isabella had so meticulously drafted was indeed a masterpiece of legal protection. It shielded all the assets she had publicly declared with clinical precision. Yet, it was precisely that perfection that proved to be her undoing. The document was silent on blue. Gum Holdings, the supply chain network, and the Callaway Fund, because those assets simply did not exist in the reality she had envisioned for me. The agreement is airtight, Angus noted, his voice smooth and professional as he shuffled a pile of documents. Every asset your client listed remains hers, fully protected and untouched. However, the assets my client holds were never subject to the agreement. They were not listed, not disclosed, and therefore not a part of the arrangement. Ostroff looked at his client, then back to Angus, his face reflecting the realization that he was trapped by the very language he had helped craft. Isabella sat rigid, her hands folded on the polished wood table. There was no room for a contest. The agreement she had imposed upon me was the same one that now defined the boundaries of her own vulnerability. She had designed a prison, and she was the only one confined within it. The proceedings were efficient, bordering on brutal in their logic. By late May, the papers were finalized. I moved out of the Point Piper residence that same week, hiring 2 men to remove what was mine, leaving everything Isabella had curated precisely where it belonged. It was a surgical, clean exit. The aftermath of our separation rippled through Voss Logistics with the force of a tectonic shift. Once the dissolution filing became public knowledge, necessitated by the restructuring of our equity holdings, the institutional investors who had once sent lavish wedding flowers in 2021 suddenly found themselves in a state of profound agitation. The stability they had sought in Isabella was gone, replaced by the uncertainty of a fractured leadership team and a board that had just discovered that a significant portion of their supply chain was effectively controlled by an outsider. Brett Callaway resigned within weeks, citing personal pursuits, though the reality was that his fund, underpinned by my capital, had become a liability he could no longer manage. The board of Voss Logistics, once the bedrock of Isabella's power, reached out to Angus. They were not seeking conflict. They were seeking a path back to stability. They required a chairman who understood the intricate supply chain mechanics that were now failing under the current administration. They were looking for the architect, and for the first time in 3 years, the board finally saw who I was. Isabella remained at the head of the company for a few more days, watching as the infrastructure she had called her own began to answer to a different authority. It was not a violent overthrow. It was the quiet, inevitable reclamation of a house built on my foundation. The finality of it was not in the signing of the papers, but in the look of absolute, cold recognition I saw in Isabella's eyes when she realized the game was not just over. It had never been hers to win. By early September 2025, the quiet, orderly life I had envisioned began to take shape in a new apartment in the Marina district of Melbourne. From the 15th floor, the bay shimmered with a cold, indifferent beauty, and the bridge was a distant silhouette against the evening sky. It was a vantage point of absolute stillness, far removed from the claustrophobic opulence of Point Piper. One Sunday morning, as I sat in a small cafe in the city, I read the announcement of my appointment as chairman of Voss Logistics. The business section of the paper detailed the restructuring with objective, sterile language, noting the stabilization of the supply chain under new leadership. Nobody in the cafe looked twice at me. I remained a man without a public face, a ghost in the machinery of industry. Dave called shortly after I finished my espresso. "I saw the news, Lachlan," he said, his voice cautious. "I told you she was intentional, but I never imagined the scope of the reality you were living." "I protected what I built, Dave," I replied, watching the morning commuters drift through the street below. "She made her choices, and I made mine. That is the nature of the board. Are you satisfied?" he asked after a long pause. I reflected on that question, letting the weight of the past 3 years settle. I thought of the December nights in our Point Piper kitchen, the cold silence of the house, and the document that had nearly cost me my sense of self. I thought of the woman I had first met at the mixer, the one I had wanted to believe in, and the woman who had eventually revealed herself to be a strategist of her own undoing. It was a grief that did not announce itself with noise. It was the quiet, necessary shedding of an illusion. "I am at peace," I said, and for the first time in years I meant it. The anger had evaporated, replaced by the profound clarity that comes when one no longer needs to perform. I had built what I built, and I had reclaimed the authority she had sought to strip away. There was no triumph in the boardroom, only the resumption of order. I looked out at the city, a place of commerce, of ambition, of fleeting connections, and realized that I had finally reclaimed my invisibility. I set the cup down and prepared for the day. There were reports to review, logistic strategies to refine, and a company to lead back toward stability. My marriage had been a lesson in the fragility of foundations, but my life, in its quiet, deliberate way, continued. I had entered the game as a consultant who dabbled, and I had emerged as the chairman of the board. The fog rolled in off the bay, obscuring the bridge in a veil of gray, as indifferent and inevitable as the passage of time. I had finally reached the end of the long game. In the silence of my new life, I realized that the greatest luxury was not the power I had reclaimed, but the freedom to simply be unknown once more. The story of Isabella and me had ended exactly as it was meant to, with the quiet closing of a door and the beginning of a life that belonged only to me.